Welcome all to our webinar, Artists in the Archive, Remembering the Genocide in Namibia Through the Arts. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Heather Blumenthal, and I'm the Executive Director of the Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Centre. The CTHGC serves as a place of commemoration and memorialization to the 6 million Jews who were killed in the Holocaust, as well as all victims of the Nazi regime. Likewise, we also stand as a centre of memory for all victims of genocide in the 20th century. Our educational programs and hosting webinars such as this creates an awareness of the consequences of prejudice, and that by being a bystander does not prevent the recurrence of mass atrocities and genocide. A year ago, I met Bonnie Berkowitz, a multi-skilled woman who has worked with the National Parliament of South Africa, non-governmental and faith organizations, as well as various academic institutions around the world. Armed with a BSc Honours in International Relations Studies and a Master's on International Human Rights Law, Bonnie came on board as a volunteer researcher with the aim of enriching our genocide programming. Today's lecture will be the first in a number of programs presented by the Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Centre. As you may be aware, at the time of hosting, Dr. Pedzisai Maedza, his Wi-Fi connection from Zimbabwe was problematic, and we had unfortunately had to postpone the webinar. As a result, we have pre-recorded his talk, and should anybody wish to ask Dr. Maedza a question or comment, please email Dimitri Abrams at the following email address: archives@holocaust.org.za. And now it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Bonnie to welcome our guest speaker.
Thank you, Heather. Welcome to all of you who are watching today, and welcome to our speaker, Pedzisai Maedza. My involvement in the Centre started over a year ago, and since then it has been an honor to help them action the expansion of the Genocide in Africa work. The work is of prime importance, as it helps us as Africans and non-Africans learn from the past and focus on how to prevent future atrocities. Many times we focus on a genocide as a whole and less on the individuals that were killed or those who were affected. The Centre is instrumental in memorializing individuals as well as groups of people. In this vein, Pedzisai's work is vital in exploring this area of memorialization. Pedzisai Maedza calls himself an intercultural performance and genocide scholar. He is the author of Performing Asylum, Theatre of Testimony in South Africa, in addition to several publications on memory and violence. Maedza holds a PhD from the Centre for Theatre, Dance and Performance Studies at the University of Cape Town and the Anthropology and African Studies Department, Johannes Gutenberg Universität, Mainz, Germany. His work has been awarded the African-German Network of Excellence in Science Junior Research Grant, the International Federation for Theatre Research New Scholars Award, as well as the African Studies Centre University of Leiden, Netherlands, African Thesis Award, amongst other accolades. He has authored a number of articles and other publications. We are delighted to have someone of your caliber, Pedzisai, joining us today and espousing your knowledge. Thank you, Pedzisai. Take it away.
Welcome. When we reflect on the violence that has been visited upon the country that we now call Namibia, the land of the brave, it is difficult to draw neat markers on the calendar about when genocidal violence starts and when it ends, if the echoes of such kind of violence can be said to end at all. Some historians have shown us that during certain times in the colonization of Africa and Namibia in particular, the killing of indigenous people called bushman hunting was considered a popular sport by Europeans, much like how big game hunting is considered today. These historians argue that these widespread murders and the destruction of livelihoods should and constitute a genocide. But for the purposes of this talk, I shall limit myself to the memory and legacy of the more widely reported on 1904 to 1908 resistance to German conquest, that is often called the Herero-German War. These dates are not definitive time frames for the war and genocide. Oral historians often tell us that the public execution of King Kahemua by German colonial forces in 1896 should be considered as a precursor of the war. They also include the 1893 massacre of the Kowesi people and argue that these this past is not sealed off from the present. Instead, it lays obligations on it. The past is a place or source of meaning, a place that is necessary for us to visit if the present is to make sense. I recognize that we have got varying degrees of familiarity about the events of the German War and the genocide in Namibia. I will therefore couch my talk for those of us who are hearing about these events for the first time. And because I'm doing this, what I will say may come across to some people with more expert knowledge as pedestrian or repetitive. Since we are commenting on the lives and pain of others, it is important that I declare from the onset that I am not Namibian myself. I hope that this talk will stimulate and to provoke more dialogue and solidarity in the experiences of others as we quest for justice. I ask that we consider pain beyond the singular bodies who experience it and consider it at a societal level. We need to ask ourselves, how do societies remember? The first port of call as we reflect on the genocide in Namibia is to pause and reflect on how we individually and as part of various societies and communities remember. In practice, memory and remembering are cognitive processes that happen in individuals' brains. However, this talk is concerned with memory beyond the body's neurocognitive capacity. We have to ask ourselves, how do we shape and influence what we remember? I'm going to speak about 5 ways in which we do this. The first is that we name things. We use names and the power of naming to shape memory. 2, we build monuments and we repurpose some monuments and we destroy others. Through these actions, we make certain areas places of memory. 3rd, we use public holidays to shape collective memory. 4th, we use photographs and documents to help us remember. And 5th, we also use art and performance in all its forms to remember. It is on this last aspect that I would like for us to dwell on. I would draw on Brett Bailey's Exhibit B to examine how some artists inform the way societal history is remembered. I frame by positioning performance as a complex interlocutor of the past in the present. This claim is premised on the assumption that the past is not simply given in memory, but it must be articulated to become memory. I focus on art and artists because culture attains its visibility through its representations. The concept of genocide, as we now know it, was introduced in 1944 by Raphael Lemkin. The word genocide, meaning race, nation, kind, or tribe, and from the Latin cedere, which means to kill. Lemkin created the term and expanded on it through his work on international law against the mass murders committed by Nazis during the Second World War. Lemkin's advocacy is largely credited for the formulation of the 1948 United Nations Genocide Convention on the Prevention, Punishment of the Crimes of Genocide. The United Nations Convention defines genocide in the following terms. Genocide means any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy in war or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent birth within the group, and fifth, in forcibly transferring children from the group to another group. Genocide is often regarded as the sustained, purposeful action by a perpetrator to physically destroy a collectivity, directly or indirectly. Let us keep this in mind as we revisit the events of 1904 to 1908. Between 1904 and 1908, German colonial forces intensified a violent war and terror campaign against the Herero and later the Nama people who resisted the colonial conquest of their land. These hostilities led to the death of 80% of the Herero and 50% of the Nama populations of central and southern Namibia. Let us reflect a little bit more on the actual Herero War. The genocidal response to the resistance was motivated by a number of factors. The primary ones being the colonial policies of the German state at the time. This came to be particularly because of the importance that Namibia held for the German colonial project. At the turn of the 20th century, Namibia was Germany's first African colony after claiming it as a protectorate on 24 April 1884. The genocide was initiated and sanctioned by Kaiser William II to grab more territory and to restore German pride after the initial military victories of the resistance forces and the tactics that the resistance initial victories were particularly stinging and unacceptable for those in the metropole who considered Africans as racially inferior. The uprising resulted in the arbitrary arrest and detention of all Hereros working for Germans, regardless of their participation or lack thereof in the uprising. The colonial German establishment cast this invasion of African territory and the resistance as a race war. Terming this a race war served to remove any sense of obligation to exercise restraint and justified the annihilation of the local population through a war of extermination. This strategy legitimized the systematic murder of both civilians and captured combatants taken in as prisoners of war. The war was officially escalated into a terrorist and genocide campaign after General von Trotha assumed command of the German army. Von Trotha arrived in Namibia to take charge of the German Imperial Army with express orders from the Kaiser to crush the rebellion by all means necessary. Von Trotha ordered and authorized the wholesome slaughter of all Herero people, including civilians, by issuing an extermination order on the 2nd of October 1904. This is what the order said. I, the great general of the German troops, sent this letter to the Herero people. Hereros are no longer German subjects. They have murdered, stolen, they have cut off the noses, ears, and other bodily parts of wounded soldiers, and now, because of cowardice, they fight no more. I say to the people, anyone who delivers one of the Herero captains to my station as a prisoner will receive 1,000 marks. He who brings in Samuel Herero will receive 5,000 marks. All the Herero must leave the land. If the people do not do this, then I will force them to do it with the great guns. Any Herero found within the German borders, with or without a gun, with or without cattle, will be shot. I shall no longer receive any women or children. I will drive them back to their people, or I will shoot them. This is my decision for the Herero people. Signed, the great general of the mighty Kaiser, von Trotter. With this order, the colonial German army officially launched a war of annihilation. Some revisionists decided to trivialize this pronouncement as casual war talk. A look at what the general also wrote in the day in question might be instructive. On the day that the order was issued, von Trotter wrote in a letter, "Now, I have to ask myself how to end the war with the Hereros. The views of the governor and also a few Africa hands on the one hand and my views on the other differ completely. The first wanted to negotiate for some time already and regard the Herero nation as necessary labor material for the future development of the country. I believe that the nation as such should be annihilated. My intimate knowledge of Central African tribes, Bantus and others, has everywhere convinced me of the necessity that the African does not respect treaties, but only brute force. I find it most appropriate that the nation perishes instead of infecting our soldiers and diminishing our supplies of water and food. Apart from that, mildness on my side would only be interpreted as weakness by the other side. They have to perish in the Sandveld or try to cross into the Bechuanaland border." News of the German army's terrorism spread, attracting negative publicity in some German press and condemnation by liberal social democrats in the German parliament. With more territory secured, the Kaiser finally bowed to domestic pressure and extensive missionary lobbying and lifted the extermination order on 9 December 1904. The lifting of the extermination order marked a new phase in the Namibian genocide. In a letter dated 11th of December 1904, the Chancellor ordered von Trotter to establish concentration camps for the temporary housing and sustenance of the Herero people. Von Trotter developed two variations of camps, both aimed at killing the prisoners: death camps like the 1905 to 1907 Shark Island, and labor camps. Indigenous people's possessions were confiscated, and new laws which forbade them from owning land or livestock were crafted. Survivors who surrendered or were captured were rounded up and chained. The survivors had the letters GH branded on them and were deported off to concentration camps where they were imprisoned as forced laborers and were made to wear metal badges bearing a number around their necks. Some survivors were deported to other German colonies of Togo, Cameroon, and Tanzania. Shark Island is a bare ground in the South Atlantic Ocean. German officers called it Death Island due to the high mortality rates witnessed there. Herero chief Daniel, survivor of Shark Island, who was detained in September 1905 and gave his testimony 13 years after his release, said, "I was sent down there with others to an island far in the south, at Lutritz. There on that island were thousands of Herero and Hottentot prisoners. We had to live there. Men, women, and children were all huddled together. We had no proper clothing, no blankets, and the night air on the sea was bitterly cold. The wet sea fogs drenched us and made our teeth chatter. The people died there like flies that had been poisoned. The great majority died there. The little children and the old people died first, and then the women, and then the weaker men. No day passed without many deaths. We begged and prayed and appealed for leave to go back to our own country, which is warmer, but the Germans refused. Those men who were fit had to work during the day in the harbor and railway depots. The younger women were selected by the soldiers and taken to their camps as concubines. At the Swakopmund labor camp, German authorities kept a register of prisoners. They classed prisoners as either men, women, and children, and they kept a tally of how many were fit or unfit for labor. The authorities also kept a death register to keep track of the death toll. The death register listed exhaustion, heart failure, bronchitis, and scurvy as standard causes of death. The death rate was so high that they kept pre-printed death certificates with the cause of death already filled in as death by exhaustion following privatation. I will now turn to examine how one artist responded to this history. Brett Bailey's Exhibit B has received mixed and controversial reactions across the world. Exhibit B drew praise and condemnation in equal measure wherever it has been shown, from Grahamstown, South Africa, to the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and Latin America. Protests have erupted in places like London and Paris to stop the show's opening, with the show being branded by some as a racist human zoo. Passionate campaigners, some of whom may not have seen the show, felt and feel that the show should be cancelled or stopped. Exhibit B illustrates how the affective reception of art and history can lead to violent and passionate outbursts of emotion. Exhibit B is a performance exhibition that animates memory and photographs from the Colonial Ethnographic Archive. It animates photographs that document the crimes committed by 19th century colonial forces in Namibia, the Belgian and French Congos, and the cold horror of apartheid. Exhibit B also draws attention to the plight of African immigrants living in and deported from Europe. I will focus on the sections of the exhibition that evoke the memory of the terrors perpetuated in colonial Namibia. I examine the use of performance to animate archival texts to create live images. In doing so, I explore how the images tell stories and histories through performance, as well as the contemporary political usage and reception of archival images. Exhibit B comprises of 12 silent tableaus arranged along a path. They read historical eras using convention. Exhibit B comprises of 12 silent tableaus arranged along a path. They recall distinct historical eras using conventions of museum display. The work is performed by a core team comprising of a 4-member Namibian choir and 14 to 16 African immigrants or asylum seekers that Brett Bailey selects in the host city. The performance starts as soon as audience members queue up to enter the exhibit. Once invited inside, audiences are led into a room with rows of chairs. They are handed a numbered card and asked to wait in absolute silence to end exhibition one at a time when their number is called. In 1903, after 2 decades of German colonization of Namibia, 712 European women lived among 3,970 European men. Despite the reports of widespread rape of indigenous women by the settler forces, prior to 1904, not a single case was heard by the German courts. The rape of local women was so widespread that the German settlers coined special terms for the practice, like going native or the dirty trade. In 1905, German forces established concentration camps, including a special rape camp. In Windhoek, the Imperial Army set up a separate camp where Herero women were kept as sex slaves. According to a missionary named as Vanderus, of the free natives, no girl went there, so people resorted to the prisoner of war Herero girls, who of their free will accepted the dirty business. I personally doubt this free will. The crow existed about 100 meters behind the fort. In Exhibit B, we revisit the memory of this molestation through an installation of a woman sitting stiffly upright on the bed. This installation recreates a German military officer's living quarters. An assortment of objects hangs on the wall. They range from a cross, hunting trophies, to guns and framed images of severed heads. These items were popular as postcards. An African woman sits stiffly upright on the bed. The woman is shackled by her neck, hands, and feet to the bed. She is naked from the waist up and with her back to the audience. In front of her is a mirror through which she stares. She makes eye contact with every audience member as they come into the room. Audience members will look at her and look into the mirror, lock eyes with her, and they see their images reflected back. Brett Bailey created this backstory for the performer. He says, I tell the woman, you were in your village one night and your husband was out fighting. Your father was out fighting. You've got 2 children. Early in the morning before the sun rises, there's a fire. You hear gunshots. People are screaming. You run from the house. You grab the children. One child falls and you don't see that child again. You hide in the bush and you see a rape going on. In the morning, they find you. Your house is on fire and your mother was in that house. You walk for days and you are in a concentration camp now. You've been there for a long time. It's fucking freezing. Your child is coughing all the time. There are children dying from cholera all around you. And a soldier comes around and tells you to go with him. He takes you and you know you are going to be raped by him afterwards. And you will submit because it means he will give you some food for your child. So you're sitting on the bed waiting for all this to happen. When you see a member enter the room in the mirror, it's the German soldier. He's taken off his clothes and he's standing with a glass of whiskey in his hand. He's got a hat on and he's saying to you, no matter if I hurt you, I don't want you to scream. Children conceived out of such rapes were often used for pseudo-experiments to prove white supremacist ideologies. In Exhibit B, this reference works at multiple levels. At one level, it embeds German concentration camps into the larger history of colonial aggression. On another level, the pseudo-scientific study of African and mixed-race people introduces an argument about the continuities of racial sexual violence connecting colonialism, fascism, and present-day biometric regimes of migration. This tableau also references the concentration camps. It is set to the ambience of melodic 19th century romantic music. A large regal woman in Herero traditional dress sits with her knees spread apart. She faces the audiences frontally and from an elevated pedestal where she retains the audience gaze. She is holding a shard of glass in her right hand, a human skull in her left hand. She sits on a pedestal entirely covered with small glittering glass shards. On the wall below her seat is a large cross. In front of her, to the left and to the right, are two high wooden posts. Strands of barbed wire are strung between them. A sign written in German is attached to the barbed wire and warns against electrocution. Torn shreds of clothing on the barbed wire suggest that someone tried to escape and tore their clothes in the attempt. To the left and to the right of the pedestal are two human skulls, each in a small glass case. This installation contains the main ingredients of colonial violence. The cross signals the Christian missionary activities that often preceded traders, settlers, and military troops. The installation refers to the concentration camps on Shark Island, where survivors of the genocide were imprisoned. Women detainees were forced to boil and scrape off the skin off the severed heads of their family and community. The skulls echo German troops under von Trotter's command, who poisoned water wells and drove people into the Omaheke Desert, where many died of thirst as they fled into what is now known as Botswana and life in the concentration camps. The glittering shards on the floor can be read as a reference to the South African diamond mines, and they are a symbol of the collision between capitalism and colonialism. The glass shards allude more specifically to the South African diamond mining companies that requested and used colonial prisoners as slaves. This installation also foregrounds a 1907 image of German soldiers packing away skulls for export to Germany. This image was turned into a postcard series. The postcard shows 5 uniformed German colonial soldiers stationed outside, packing human skulls into a wooden crate under a clear sky. That this Gotham photograph was turned into a postcard, a popular public mass medium, seems to suggest that during the war and the genocide in colonial Namibia and Germany, decapitating African people and collecting human remains was not regarded as inhumane by the photographers, the designers, the senders, and all the receivers of the postcard. The final station in Exhibit B makes the mourning of the dead and the desecration into its central concern. 4 Namibian singers deliver songs of lamentation. The singers' heads, painted a greasy black, are visible above white pedestals covering their bodies, giving the impression of live museum displays. Mounted on the wall behind and over these disembodied singing heads are enlarged photographs of the severed heads of German victims, of genocide victims. The installation was titled The Cabinet of Eugen Fischer and provided details about the career of this prominent physical anthropologist. Eugen Fischer conducted notorious craniology studies on racially mixed people in Namibia and in Germany, and became a leading racial scientist under the Nazis. Eugen Fischer founded an institute in Berlin that taught eugenics and trained people like Josef Mengele, nicknamed the Angel of Death, who performed human experiments at Auschwitz. Other Fischer prodigies included Eva Justin, who advocated for the sterilization and murder of a gypsy research subjects. Fischer was eventually appointed rector of the Friedrich Wilhelm University of Berlin by Adolf Hitler in 1933. Among other notorieties, Eugen Fischer championed the Nuremberg race laws of 1935, on which the South African apartheid war laws were later modeled. Fischer also co-developed the Fischer-Seller scale, which supposedly determined the racial origins of people. Later part of his career, Fischer became part of the Gestapo's Special Commission No. 3, which carried out the discreet sterilization of Afro-Germans born to European mothers. After World War II, despite these controversies, Fischer remained affiliated with many leading German universities. He was emeritus professor at Freiburg University and also an honorary member of the post-war German Anthropological Association until his death in 1967. The University of Freiburg still holds up to 1,500 human remains in its collections from this era. By naming this station after Fischer, Brett Bailey emphasized the ideological continuities between colonial racial science, the Nazi racial state, and the post-war German democracy. In Exhibit B, colonial memories are evoked through the aestheticization of pain. The installations are framed in such a way that audiences have to negotiate how the performers return the spectator's gaze directly or reflected in a mirror. This dramaturgical choice makes it difficult for Exhibit B to be viewed or photographed without engagement. This can be considered as the device that gives Exhibit B its subversive and affective power. The performance audiences are forced to reflect their placement as consumers of the performance in relation to the historical systems being staged. While it might not have been the artist's intention to offend, the performance reception shows that some sections of the society were incensed by the choices made in Exhibit B. Opponents of the performance argue that it injures and it traumatizes the persons of African descent by entrenching rather than challenging racial stereotypes. They argue that it was unethical for Brett Bailey, as a white South African man, to appropriate the experience of Black African people for commercial and artistic gain. The use of blackface, prevalent in the show, has a long and highly inflammatory history in performance and race relations, from the ministerial shows through the Triple K to today. Some critics feel that its continued use can never be justified, nor should it be tolerated given its racist symbolisms and connotations. The fact that these images can be included in textual form as history or part of the historical accounts without any objections, and yet create a storm when they are staged, points to performance potential to effectively recast memory and to stimulate debate and engagement with the legacy of the past. In Namibia and in the diaspora, the human remains that feature in Exhibit B have become powerful actors in international relations and domestic affairs around the memory of the colonial genocide. In 2011, 2014, and in 2018, some human remains were returned. We can only hope that all human remains and artifacts will make their way home. Brett Bailey is not alone in using art to engage with the memory of the genocide in Namibia. The lynchings and the human remains also feature prominently in the works of other artists who remember this genocide. The human remains make an appearance in multiple works, such as in William Kentridge's Black Box and Tembambuli and Unmute Dance Company's Sold. Joining us are some of the artists making some thought-provoking work that we should all pay attention to. Novels like The Other Side of Silence, Mama Namibia, The Scattering, and The Lie of the Land also touch on the memory of the Namibian genocide and will be interesting to people who would want to read up some more. This year, Joseph Madisia's work was also on show at the Black Berlin Biennale. Exhibitions like Germany and Namibia, Memories of a Violent Past, and several other exhibitions also touch on the memory of the Namibian genocide. I use the analogy of scars to frame these artworks. When we suffer bodily injury, the skin sometimes gets scarred. Years later, when we look at our bodies, we can use the scar as a reminder of the events that led to this scarring. The scar itself does not and cannot tell the whole story, but it remains a reminder of the occasion where we were injured. The bulk of the existent images that we have in the archive show the perpetrators and the missions' views of the victims and survivors. Artists who engage with this material do not only animate the archive, but often seek to reinterpret it. Artists navigate the uncertain terrain of establishing the ethical use of colonial photography in fostering memory. Artists are compelled to find creative and ethical ways of engaging with these images of death and the leftovers of the process of annihilation. Artists give agency and individuality to the individuals who are often depicted as nothing but victims. We are reminded of the humanity and lives that were robbed in the creation of museums and scientific artifacts. Artists who engage with archival material force us to reconsider who counts as human, whose lives count as lives, and finally, what makes for a grieving or grievable life. Artists remind us that remembering is an ethical act and it has got ethical value in and of itself. For genocide remembrance, memory is achingly the only relation we have with the dead. Artists in the archive show us that to remember, one must imagine. Thank you.
Thank you, Pedzisai, for an extremely interesting and thought-provoking talk. To you, our audience, we thank you for joining us for this recording. Remember that should you wish to ask Pedzisai any questions, please email Dimitri Abrams at the following email address: archives@holocaust.org.za. We look forward to hearing from you. Be safe, be healthy.